Thank you all for joining us today. As we think about it, it would really be impossible for us to hold a summit on retail without devoting a significant amount of attention and time to small business retailers. According to the National Retail Federation, the overwhelming majority of retailers are small businesses, and more than 98% of those retail companies employ fewer than 50 people. So when COVID struck a year ago, really the impact on retailers was twofold. On the one front, we had temporary closures of non-essential businesses, or restrictions on the number of people. So we had a lot of retailers who shuttered or were just severely limited in the number of people that were allowed on their premises. On the other hand, we had this major disruption in the supply chain. So few of us can forget the empty shelves, the shortages of paper towels and toilet paper last summer. But beyond that unavailability, what really happened was that we saw a shortage of raw materials, everything from rubber to microchips, steel, that caused production delays that really continue to cause scarcity issues for retailers across any number of categories. Now, in the end, sadly, many of the businesses that temporarily closed last year have closed permanently. But the good news is that in the indomitable American spirit, we see that nearly 500,000 new businesses opened in the U.S., and that's according to Yelp data, during the pandemic. So it's about 14% fewer than the previous 12 months, but really considering the difficulties of the past year, it's really nothing short of miraculous. So, of course, much, if not most of that growth is really coming from small business. And that's why I'm so pleased today to introduce everyone to our special guest, Tom Sullivan. Tom is the Vice President of Small Business Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a post he's held for the past 4 years. He works with local and regional chambers of commerce in the U.S. Chamber's national network to ensure that the views of small business are properly represented and positioned to government agencies, really to advocate for federal policies that bolster free enterprise and reward entrepreneurship. So he runs the U.S. Chamber Small Business Council, and there the mission is to increase small business input and involvement in the overall chamber's activities. As an attorney, Tom has been an advocate for small business throughout most of his career, with both government and private sector positions. He served under President George W. Bush as the chief counsel for advocacy in the U.S. Small Business Administration, making him the highest ranking government official charged with exclusively advocating the views and needs of small business, really before government agencies and Congress. So in that post, he really was directly involved in more than 100 regulatory and legislative matters. He testified frequently before congressional committees. So today is going to be a piece of cake because we're not Congress. And he was a spokesperson on economic conditions that really improved small business entrepreneurship. So we're thrilled to have him today, given the events of the past year and the dramatic adjustments that were really caused by the pandemic. Tom is going to give us a better understanding of how small business survive 2020 and what's in store. From the numbers that I see, retail sales are expected to rise between 6.5% and 8.2%. And so this rapid deployment of COVID vaccines seems to be having a positive effect on what's happening. So, Tom, thank you for joining us today. If you don't mind, can we start off by getting a better sense of how important small businesses are to the U.S. economy and the job market, and then how your role at the Chamber of Commerce helps to advance those?
Well, thank you, Tony. It's good to be here. I should preface my remarks by saying I am heavily biased. I am an advocate for small business, and I work at the world's largest business federation, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where we represent roughly 3 million businesses. About 96% of those businesses have fewer than 100 employees. About 75% of our membership, which includes about 2,000 local chambers of commerce. So you take that all together, over 75% have fewer than 10 employees. So I do like to preface my remarks by saying I am heavily biased towards small business. So when you put a ball on the tee, as gently as you did, and you said, how important are small business? I think folks probably guess that my response will be they're very important. Or if I went back to my Boston days, I'd say they're wicked important. From a data perspective, we know that job creation primarily comes from small business. And if you look at rough estimates over the past 15, 20 years, you see 2/3 of the net new jobs come from small business. Now I say net because of the churn. And I know, Tony, we have a more sophisticated group who is joining us today. So I think there's probably a greater understanding of what churn means. And you already touched on it, is that there's kind of bad news, good news. Bad news is an enormous amount of businesses that have shuttered. Good news is that out of that destruction have come some really incredible new businesses. That in itself is churn. And historically, in the free enterprise system that America is so proud of, we do see that churn generates higher employment businesses each time. Each time some business fails in their garage, chances are that their next business is going to have some people, multiple people working out of their garages. So that's the type of churn that I talk about. And so when we're looking at getting people back to work, and obviously the vaccinations play a critical role in this, we're looking at folks coming back to work. We're looking at a growth in the small business sector to help spur that broader economic success for the country.
That's great, and thank you for admitting your bias. I think most of us are biased as well. In fact, in some recent work that we did among affluents, we found the vast majority of them were saying that given everything that's going on, they want to support small businesses to help them recover. So we share your bias.
Thank you.
Now, as I look at some of the data that's coming out, there's a recent small business pulse survey from the Census Bureau that reported that more than 6 in 10 small businesses said that they'd had a moderate to large negative effect from the coronavirus pandemic. So what were small business receipts like prior to COVID? How badly were they hurt during COVID, and how are they currently doing in terms of the recovery?
Well, Tony, it's interesting because when we're asked this question a lot, our tendency in the Washington, D.C. space is to try to lump everybody together. It's just easier, right? Yep. What we found throughout the pandemic, though, is that is very dangerous. Now, first of all, small business, every small business, even within a specific sector, is a little bit different. That's part of the beauty of small businesses. But the sectors within small business are very different as how they've been affected by the coronavirus. There's 2 parts to it that we found from data. So the first part is by industry. And we'll start with how things are going on the good side. So construction. Construction is booming. Their biggest issue right now is finding and keeping qualified and willing employees. Now you look at the other end of the spectrum, and it's restaurants. So some have said the closer you are to a direct human interaction to a customer, the more likely you are hit heavily. So you have 2 parts of that spectrum. You have construction, in particular, home construction, really doing really well. On the other side of the spectrum, you have restaurants have been absolutely devastated. There's another part of it, though, that very few folks understand, and that is a demographic difference. And that demographic, what we've seen from data, with the help of Ipsos, by the way, What we found, though, is that minority businesses were hit harder, and there are some reasons to this. One of the reasons is that in economically distressed areas where there are more minority businesses, they were hit harder by the pandemic. Another reason is that minority-owned businesses are traditionally smaller. So the general small business population, about 83%, are sole proprietors, non-employers. In Black-owned businesses, 96% are sole proprietors. And so when you're a sole proprietor and you get hit hard, the way that we see minority businesses get hit in the pandemic, it hurts more. Mm-hmm. So you've got the sectors, then you've got the demographics. And I think what is particularly difficult about the demographics is not only were they impacted harder during the pandemic, they were least likely to be able to get capital. When we first surveyed early on in the pandemic, I think it was 13% of minority-owned businesses couldn't get a loan compared to the general population of small businesses of about 7% not being able to get a loan. And so if you're hit harder, plus you have a harder time building yourself back up, it's a double whammy. And so that accounts for the differences of how some businesses are doing well and conversely, how some small businesses are really struggling. We look at sector specific and then we look at demographic specific to see not only how they're doing, but in my world, more importantly, where do we put the policy emphasis to help those that are struggling more? I think a common term that we've used is that this is a K-shaped pandemic. The upper part of the K represents construction, largely, some essential manufacturing, which coincidentally is doing pretty well compared to pre-pandemic. Mm-hmm. Lower part of that K, not doing very well. Live venues, restaurants, and also small businesses in economically distressed areas. And so as a policy focus, we've tried to work with Congress and the administration to focus the stimulus at the lower part of that K. And that's where we are right now.
Well, that's great. And it's interesting because we've been doing some research along those lines as well and seeing, similar issues along racial disparity. Even among affluent African Americans, we're seeing some of these issues. So, clearly COVID hit things disproportionately. Can you give us some illustration or some examples of some of the businesses that were able to change their focus on a dime? In some ways, their small size enabled them to be, a little bit of an easier time changing.
So I love that you didn't use the word that so many people are sick of right now, pivot. Like the most overused word in the past 12 months was pivot. I thought it was just a March Madness term, but evidently it's not. It's been how do businesses get hit with the pandemic and somehow survive, and in some cases do really well. So I think there's two parts of it that we've observed. The first part, and Tony, the previous panel really kind of focused in on this. Mm. When the pandemic hit, there were a set of challenges that no one anticipated.
Right.
And the beauty of free enterprise in the United States is they fill that need. They solve, I guess to put it more simply, entrepreneurs solve problems. Mm-hmm. That's it. I mean, it's really that simple. And when you step back and say, well, there was a heck of a lot of problems early on in the pandemic. I mean, all of a sudden, America's a huge percentage of America's workforce all of a sudden was working at home. Mm-hmm. Well, that presents some huge problems. And small businesses acted to fill or to solve those problems. So where we saw some of the most exciting and innovative growth was logistics and delivery directly focused at an enormous population working at home. We saw tremendous growth, and census that you mentioned earlier has been measuring likely employer startups. And they found that in transportation and logistics that we're focusing in on solving that problem are really doing the best. So that's the innovation economy, which is really exciting. And if we get to it, I'll explain a little bit about how much better we're doing now compared to what took 10 years after the recession. We're already actually past where that took 10 years under the recession. Another part of it, though, and this gets at the overused term of pivoting, what we found was the small business owners who were just really hanging on and struggling listened to their employees in a way that wasn't just a luxury, it was to survive. And it allowed them to, some of them, to narrow in on a uniqueness that they provided their customers that they then tried to scale up. I'll give you an example. We were talking with a restaurateur early in the pandemic, and this restaurateur had become relatively well known because of the fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, fruit, and ingredients that were locally grown in their restaurant. They were forced to close because of the pandemic, and then eventually started doing carryout. And the owner told us that during one of those days where they're doing carryout, a few customers came up and said, "Hey, you know, I'm really nervous about even coming here to get this food, but I love how fresh your fruits and vegetables and your meat are. Where do you buy them? Because I would like to actually buy them." And the light bulb went on above this small business owner's brain. He said, "Wait a minute, maybe we can create a market where we actually sell the things that we've used to create our brand." And so they did. They pivoted, and they became a market where folks would come in and get the fresh fruits and vegetables that this restaurant had been famous for, but not to enjoy the dining experience, but to actually enjoy something that the owner maybe had taken for granted pre-pandemic. And it allowed for them not only to survive, but to do very well. And we hear sometimes questions about, well, what will survive past the pandemic that was new during the pandemic? And in this particular instance, this restaurateur will have a kind of side grocery for as long as it's in existence because of listening and narrowing into a customer need and then refocusing a business on addressing that need. So we're finding that the refocusing based on customer input at an all-time high.
Well, I like the fact that there are fewer people involved in the decision making, so that those decisions can be made quickly and they can be implemented rather than having to work through a large corporate structure. And what we've obviously seen over the years is that those kinds of innovations eventually make their way into other places. They really are where we suddenly change our approach to things. So let's, it's funny, you talk about people being concerned about coming back in or coming in. Some of our research has shown that about the public is really split. About half of them cannot wait to get back to normal, get back into the retail stores and do the kinds of shopping that they want to do. And what was interesting in the research that we did was that you would think it would be the older people feeling that way, but we're seeing a lot of the younger people. In fact, more younger people are saying they want to get back in. And at the same time, we're also seeing about half of the people saying, I've gotten so used to buying this stuff online that, frankly, I'm just going to continue. Now, the odd thing to me was I expected to see that of the younger people. And in fact, I'm seeing a lot of the older folks who, are essentially saying, I'm buying stuff that I used to buy in the store. So, what advice can you give, retailers for dealing with this strange, split in the public?
Well, my advice, which is only based on the small business owners who I work with every day, is really twofold. So the first is having an online presence. So contrary to popular belief, small retailers had the growth trajectory of having an online presence had not really been very steep pre-pandemic. And there's various reasons. Like I had said earlier, every small business, and quite frankly, every small retailer is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. It's no longer become a luxury to have an online presence. And it is beyond a simple authentication that you're a legitimate business, although that certainly is important. There is now an expected e-commerce attribute to having a physical and online presence. So the hybrid model is no longer a luxury, it is absolutely a necessity. And so that will continue long term. From an advice perspective, what I hear from small businesses, and this dovetails a little bit towards the restaurateur that I mentioned, it's to narrow in on what makes your business special.
Yep.
What's your niche? What do you do? What do you do well? And what do customers, most importantly, what do customers believe you do well? And hyper focus on that, and try to avoid the Swiss Army knife phenomenon of trying to be everything to every different customer. So that hyper focus on the unique value that customers get from an individual retailer is something that is, I think it has been over the past 12 months, a focus. I think that focus will continue long term.
Great. So one of the things that you'd mentioned earlier, the need to make sure that in some of the loan options and some of the relief packages that we make sure they're getting to the right businesses. So the pace of vaccinations is picking up. Things are sort of starting to get back to normal. What do you think the priorities should be for the government at this point to make sure that they're supporting small businesses in this recovery?
Well, one of the things that I found remarkable throughout the pandemic, I'm not surprised, but remarkable, was just the community outpouring to help small businesses. And while I think generally we think that means spending money, which is certainly the most important thing to keep a small business going, it went way beyond that. It went into the actual governmental structure that coexists with the business community. I'll give you an example. Retail establishments and restaurants in New York City have, for the past 12 months, once they went into a reopening, have had more flexibility with regulation, with taking up sidewalk space, interacting with government officials at a local level who say, how can I help you? Not, oh, you didn't fill out this paperwork, you got a parking ticket, you're putting glass into your plastic recyclables. Like, they're less concerned with the gotcha, and they're more concerned with the help you. And I think that has to continue. Because, as you had said, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And that light is primarily based on vaccines and the confidence that it's built within the economy. But what we found in our latest small business poll that we do with Ipsos is that there's still, it's over 54% who believe that it's a long tunnel. So we have not been able to break the 50% attitude that it will take longer than 6 months to recover. And that tells me that outpouring of support that is not just customers, but is the entire regulatory structure has to continue with this help you, not gotcha mentality. And I think that if that exists at a local, state, regional, and national level, I have no doubt that the small business economy is going to come roaring back. And that is certainly a data-based assumption because of the pent-up demand and the savings that exists in people's savings accounts all across the country. So maybe we could celebrate Christmas in August this year.
Wouldn't that be nice? According to the research that we did, September 26th is when everything returns back to normal.
Okay.
Yeah, at least according to our respondents.
I'll write that down, September 26th.
I told people that we'll be able to meet for a drink in person on September 26th. So put that down on your calendar.
I put down 27 because the 26th is going to be really crowded.
You're probably right. You're probably right. One last question from me, and then I know we're probably got some questions from the audience. Given the disparity in what's going on with a lot of states, reopening everything, and getting rid of things like mask mandates, we know that from our research that people are still concerned about these things. How do retailers deal with the fact that suddenly they become the mask police, if you will, or the sanitation police?
Well, that has been a difficult issue for 11 or 12 months, and it continues to be. What I've seen is that, and this is backed by some of our survey work, is that small business owners are looking out for their employees first,
it makes sense.
It's not intuitive, though. A lot of folks think, well, they're looking out for their customers because they want to make more money. It's much more personal. What we found is it's much more personal than that. When you survey small business owners and say, what are you worried about? And over 70% come back and say, I'm worried about my employees' health, then their mental health. Mm-hmm. It really starts to sink in about what happens when there's a loosey-goosey kind of situation going on about masks and vaccines and temperature checks. And I think the answer is when the employers focus primarily on their employees, then it starts to work out. When an employer says, I'm sorry, we have a significant group of folks who work here and want to serve you who are in a vulnerable population, and because of that, you have to wear masks. That's a lot different than a conversation that says, that a local law enforcement says to small business owners, you have to enforce that. And so I think that there is a recognized leadership role by the small business owners. And what we're seeing, at least, is that those small business owners are looking after their employees first, and then things start to kind of work themselves out from there.
Yeah. I think when you know the name of every one of your employees, that's a subtle difference or a significant difference from how you might approach your business otherwise. Yeah. Wendy, do we have questions?
Yes, and first of all, Tom, you're fabulous. It was really nice perspective. Our first question actually relates to what you were just talking about with the small business focused on employees first. And that might be your answer to this question, but it's, what can other businesses such as big retailers learn from small business that they're probably not doing as well now?
Well, far be it from me to tell a business owner, like, you should listen to this or that. So I'll defer back to a friend of mine, Professor William Baumol, who was a longtime professor at NYU, unfortunately passed away. But he insisted that, he called it the David and Goliath symbiosis. And he insists that smalls and bigs can't act like each other, but they both serve a valuable role. When you look to small businesses for the innovation, we look for the larger businesses to bring those innovations to market because they're able to scale sometimes better than a small innovative company. So I think the advice is for some of the bigger retailers, look at what some of your small competitors are doing, see how you can scale it, because some of those smaller guys they can certainly innovate quicker, but they can't scale as quickly.
Great, thank you. And one more question. What kinds of small businesses do you think will thrive fastest in the post-vaccine world, maybe before September 26th? If you were investing money into small business, would you look at a specific type or industry?
I think any small business that belongs to its local chamber is definitely going to be the one to bet on.
That was a great answer.
That's a great answer. Okay, one other question came in. Of the challenges small businesses have had to deal with during COVID, which do you think will be the hardest to overcome as we go forward?
So I think the hardest to overcome will be when government has shut you down and you depend on crowds to be successful. So you take a live venue where you were going to go and see a rock and roll band, perhaps. There are a number of things that make that even more difficult to restart. So first of all, government has got to make sure that it's safe for crowds to gather. Second of all, you've got to make sure your employees are safe. And third, and this I think is really the kicker, because it extends across the entire business environment. You know, after September 26th, when Tony says the economy will be back to normal, you're going to have enormous competition for the best employees. So you look at a venue that depends on crowds, it depends on keeping its employees safe. They're going to need those best employees back working for them. And it is going to be the toughest time to attract that talent back to work for them, because competition for talent after September 26th will be at an all-time high.
That's great. That's really really important. I think we're at time. Tony, do you have any words?
Other than to thank Tom, this has been a wonderful session. It's been enjoyable working with you. So thank you for helping us out today.
Well, thank you for having me, and keep doing great work. I really do rely on the Ipsos data to make some of these judgments and certainly to advise Congress on how to do better by directing stimulus to the small businesses that need it most.
Well, we wish you luck in all of the support that you're giving to small business out there.